In ancient Mesopotamia, what we might today call brothel workers were often tied up in something more complex: sacred rites, temple practices, and early urban economies. At temples dedicated to deities like Inanna or Ishtar, there were workers, some priestesses, some initiates, some simply employed by the temple, who participated in rituals that often involved ceremonial intimacy. It sounds dramatic, but the truth is, most of it was ritualized, repetitive, and slow. Candles were lit, incense was ground, floors were swept, prayers were mumbled, and somewhere in that quiet repetition, offerings were made. Most historians today believe the myth of widespread sacred prostitution is overstated. What's more likely is that sex work in Mesopotamia, while present, was just one of the many daily trades, like weaving, brewing, or scribing. Workers often lived where they worked, sharing sleeping mats behind woven curtains, waking up to the smell of bread from street vendors and the low clatter of bronze pans outside. Rates were simple. Payments were often made in barley or beer. Contracts, yes, even for sex work, were sometimes recorded on clay tablets, baked and stored like any other business record. The workers may have worn small bells or jewelry to signify their trade, though it's unclear whether that was for allure or identification. Probably both. The lupanar, Rome's efficient system. Now let's walk slowly, very slowly, to ancient Rome. Rome, in its obsessive order and record-keeping, brought state licensing and taxation into the sex trade. Workers were required to register, pay taxes, and sometimes even carry small plaques noting their profession. One could argue that brothel work in Rome was more bureaucratic than anything else. The lupanar, Rome's term for a brothel, from lupa, meaning she-wolf, was a small stone building, often with no windows, located near bathhouses or busy marketplaces. Inside, narrow stone rooms, barely 6 feet across, each with a short bed made of wood or stone, sometimes with a thin straw mat. Candles flickered. Walls were often decorated with erotic frescoes, but those weren't unique or shocking. They were simply part of Roman decor, like a menu on the wall of a modern diner. And yes, they had menus, sometimes painted above the doors, sometimes scratched into the walls, listing available services and their cost in Roman coinage. These prices were often shockingly low, which tells us more about Roman currency and economy than anything else. A brothel worker's day began at sunrise. Wash face, light lamp, pull curtain, wait. There wasn't really a boss per se, but there were house managers or landlords. Some brothels were independent, others were owned by wealthy patrons who took a cut of the earnings. The workers might see several clients in a day, but in between, there was a lot of waiting, napping, or chatting softly with other workers while the sounds of Roman life floated in from outside. Ox carts creaking, hawkers shouting about fish or oil or figs. Pompeii gives us an eerie time capsule. Preserved in ash, the city's most famous brothel shows us stone beds. Graffiti scratched into walls, Meritus was here, and Vibia is the best, and even the remnants of old lamps and jugs. It tells a story not of glamour or danger, but of routine. Very human, very sleepy routine. Greek symposia and courtesan calm. In Athens, things looked a little different, particularly among the hetairae, a class of high-status courtesans. These weren't brothel workers in the traditional sense. They were educated, witty, and often part of intellectual society. Attending symposia, those wine-fueled gatherings where men discussed philosophy and politics for hours, often in togas that got progressively more wrinkled. Hetairai would sometimes entertain clients over multiple days, offering conversation, music, companionship, and sometimes intimacy. They lived in relatively comfortable homes, had servants, and managed their own finances. It was quiet work, at times lonely, at times filled with long stretches of soft music and wine that was too diluted to do much. Meanwhile, in the lower districts of Athens, other workers ran smaller operations. They might rent a single room, hang a red ribbon on the doorpost, and light a lamp outside to signify availability. The work was transactional, sometimes fleeting, but also highly normalized. Common threads. The work behind the curtain. Across these cultures, from Sumer to Athens to Rome, brothel work was structured, mundane, and regulated. There were rest days, there were tax payments, there were illnesses and temple festivals that paused business. People shared meals, argued about customers, borrowed clothing, and got bored. Most of all, there was routine. That's the real heartbeat of this story. The smell of stale oil lamps, the careful folding of bed linens, the small ledger where a worker tracked coins earned that week.
Behind the curtains, medieval and Renaissance brothel life. Let's slip forward now, not in a rush, but with the slow, steady pace of an ox cart through a muddy street. Time has passed. Rome has crumbled. Empires have come and gone. The world is a little colder, a little muddier, and the perfume of ancient incense has been replaced by the faint, persistent smell of damp wool and wood smoke. We are now somewhere in medieval Europe, perhaps in London, or Paris, or Bruges, during a time when brothel work was not just tolerated, but often officially licensed and quietly woven into the urban economy. The brothels of this era didn't have the stone walls of Pompeii or the intellectual sparkle of a Greek symposium. But they had something else: schedules, rules, and a whole lot of laundry. The stew houses of Southwark. Let's start in London, just across the River Thames in a district called Southwark. It was known for its stew houses. A misleadingly cozy term, as these weren't places for soup, but rather a combination of public bathhouses and brothels. The name likely came from the warm, steamy air inside. By the 12th century, these stew houses were regulated by law. In fact, by the 14th century, they were under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Winchester, who licensed and taxed them. Hence the term Winchester geese, a local nickname for the women who worked there. These women were technically not protected by the church, yet paid fees to it. Each stew house had to follow a long list of rules. For instance, workers could not be married. The house had to be closed on Sundays, religious holidays, and during Lent. Workers were not allowed to solicit on the streets. No one with a visible illness could work. Yes, there were health inspections. Prices were standardized. The workday. Fairly ordinary. Workers would begin with chores, sweeping floors, heating water for baths, tidying up rooms. Breakfast might be a small bowl of pottage or a heel of bread soaked in ale. Clients arrived mid-morning, sometimes drunk, sometimes grumpy, often both. Services were brief, businesslike, and afterward, there were more chores, laundry, bed-making, and preparing for the next guest. The brothel keepers, often women known as bawds, ran the houses like inns. They handled scheduling, cleaned linens, negotiated disputes, and made sure no one was working on forbidden days. They might even scold workers for being too slow or too chatty with customers. But there were breaks, too. Women would gather in the common room, share gossip, brush each other's hair, or stitch worn clothing. In the evenings, they might sit quietly near the fire and doze, the sound of the city softening as curfew bells rang in the distance. Waxing crescent moon Parisian regulation and midnight inspections. In Paris, brothels were also tightly regulated, especially by the 15th century. City officials maintained official lists of workers. brothels were required to hang red lanterns outside their doors, a trad. Waxing crescent moon Parisian regulation and midnight inspections. In Paris, brothels were also tightly regulated, especially by the 15th century. City officials maintained official lists of workers. Brothels were required to hang red lanterns outside their doors, a tradition that would persist for centuries. In some cases, city inspectors would arrive at midnight with lanterns in hand, performing quiet checks to ensure the workers were healthy and the rules were being followed. They'd knock gently, step inside, take a slow look around, nod, and leave. Many brothels had small shrines inside, a little corner for the Virgin Mary or a candle dedicated to a local saint. The workers might pause there briefly each morning, muttering a sleepy prayer for protection or better paying clients. The brothel rooms themselves were simple: wooden walls, rough linen sheets, iron hooks for hanging clothing, and chamber pots that no one enjoyed emptying. There was little glamour, but also little chaos. Just work. Pay varied. Some women earned enough to buy gifts, rent better rooms, or even retire early. Others struggled. But what was consistent across most cities was the routine. Days repeated with the sameness of church bells: wake, clean, work, rest, repeat. Yarn daily life in the Renaissance brothel. By the 15th and 16th centuries, Europe was blooming into the Renaissance, and brothels were adapting too. In cities like Florence, Venice, and Seville, brothels became larger, more ornate, and often run by women who had once been workers themselves. In Venice, the state even passed a law requiring brothel workers to appear in open windows without undergarments, a bizarre attempt to boost tourism and taxation. Still, the workers spent most of their time indoors, not advertising, but sitting near the fireplace, sewing or sleeping until someone knocked. In Florence, brothels were located in specific districts, sometimes painted pink to distinguish them. Some were quiet, well-kept, with velvet curtains and carved headboards. Others were cramped and dim. In both cases, the workers managed their schedules. There were no shifts, only rhythms. Slow mornings. Midday naps. A few clients scattered across the hours. Many brothels employed musicians to play lute or harp in the background, not to excite, but to fill the silence. Imagine a cold stone hallway, candlelight flickering, and a tired young woman humming along to a tune she's heard 1,000 times. There were stories, of course, of love, heartbreak, danger. But for most, the days were marked more by repetition than drama. The most exciting event might be the arrival of a shipment of clean linens or a new pair of slippers. And those were good days. Bread, food, friendship, and fatigue. Meals were humble: cheese, bread, onions, dried fish. Watered wine if there was any. Some brothels had cooks, others relied on street vendors. On cold nights, the workers would curl up under wool blankets and talk quietly, about home, about customers, about dreams they only half believed in. Sometimes, a worker would leave, marry, vanish, start an inn. Others stayed for years, becoming de facto managers or caretakers. Their lives didn't always end in tragedy or romance. Sometimes, they just faded quietly into history. And in a way, that's the charm of it. These were not dramatic heroines, or nameless victims. They were workers. With routines. With dull days and cozy nights. With slippers that wore out and curtains that needed mending. And in the great, swirling mess of medieval and Renaissance history, wars, plagues, kings, crusades, they kept to the edges. Washing linens. Boiling tea. Waiting. Living. By the time the 17th century arrived, the cities had grown taller, the fabric softer, and the rules stricter. Brothels were no longer just tolerated; in some places, they were inspected, inventoried, even decorated by law. Still, for the workers inside, the days passed with quiet repetition. Tea in the morning. linens folded with creases. Visitors announced with a soft knock. Some workers lived inside brothels their entire lives, not trapped, not glamorous, simply, occupied. Their routines were as ordinary as those of a seamstress or baker, long hours, aching feet, and the occasional broken window. Let's wander softly through the velvet-lined halls of history's quieter brothels. Red lanterns in Edo, Japan. In Japan, the Yoshiwara district of Edo, modern-day Tokyo, was a world unto itself. Walled off from the city, Yoshiwara was a licensed pleasure quarter, home to tea houses, brothels, and carefully trained courtesans known as oiran. These were not women plucked from the streets. They were trained from girlhood in music, poetry, flower arranging, conversation, calligraphy, and the complex art of making a guest feel like the center of the universe. Oiran wore elaborate multi-layered kimonos, heavy with embroidered silk, and impossibly high wooden sandals that clicked softly as they walked. Their days were heavily scheduled, often beginning before sunrise. Servants helped them dress, a process that could take an hour or more. Their hair was arranged into elaborate, lacquered styles that could weigh as much as a small melon. Afterward, they might practice music, write letters, or receive visitors. But most of their time was spent waiting for guests to arrive, for tea to boil, for fabric to be mended, for the hours to pass. Not all workers in Yoshiwara were oiran. Many were lower ranked, offering companionship and services in smaller establishments. Their lives were harder, less elegant, more work. Still, the rhythm was consistent. Wake. Dress. Greet. Wait. Sleep. The scent of sandalwood incense hung in the air, mixing with the smell of tatami mats and the faint rustle of silk. Evenings were lit with soft lanterns, casting gentle shadows on paper walls. The entire district had a dreamlike pace, an intentional slowness meant to separate it from the world outside. Further west, in Mughal India, brothel workers, particularly the tawaifs, occupied a unique space between artistry and companionship. Tawaifs were trained dancers, singers, poets, and conversationalists. Their services often involved music recitals, poetry readings, and long discussions over pawn and sherbet. Like the oiran of Japan, they moved with dignity and precision, dressed in silks, and surrounded by perfumes and low lighting. Their homes, called kotas, were not just brothels, but cultural salons. A nobleman might spend an entire evening listening to ghazals and sipping cardamom tea without anything more physical occurring. Still, the routines remained. Bathing rituals. Chores. Practice sessions. Guest registers. Gossip over breakfast. The quiet removal of a hairpin at the end of a long evening. For lower-class workers in less refined establishments, life was simpler and more physically demanding, but no less structured. Many lived in shared quarters, cooked together, and helped care for one another's children. Morning prayers, floor sweeping, combing one another's hair, then work. And waiting. Always waiting. Candled velvet parlors of Victorian Europe. Meanwhile, in 18th and 19th century Paris, London, and Berlin, brothel work had taken on a new tone, one of polished formality and relentless scheduling. Brothels, now called maisons closes in France or bawdy houses in England, were inspected by the police, recorded in ledgers, and organized almost like small hotels. In Paris, a maison close might be 4 stories high, each floor assigned to a different class of clientele. Workers wore uniforms, often matching dresses or corsets, and followed daily timetables. At 10 a.m., the maids woke everyone. At noon, linen inspections. At 2 p.m., makeup and hair. By 5 p.m., rooms were lit and clients began arriving. There were rest days, though not often. Brothel keepers, usually women, handled the money, hired laundry staff, paid the bribes to local inspectors, and enforced curfews. No clients after midnight. No drunken scenes. No unsanctioned visitors. Between clients, workers rested. Read. Sewed. Some wrote letters. Others stared into fireplaces. Meals were simple: eggs, tea, bread, cold meats. If they were lucky, perhaps a slice of pie. There were small luxuries: perfume from Grasse, lace fans, new stockings. But even these grew dull. As one 19th-century Parisian worker reportedly said, "The trouble with velvet sheets is that they still need washing." By the mid-1800s, many European countries had introduced official sex work registers. Women had to carry identification cards, submit to medical exams, and report to police stations weekly. The bureaucracy was dull, but enforced with alarming precision. Workers in some cities had to log the number of clients they saw, not for taxation, but for moral hygiene. Doctors issued pink slips or white cards to signal health status. Inspectors visited without warning, peering at bedding, sniffing for disinfectant, and checking for proper record-keeping. It was a time when brothel work became oddly professionalized, yet still boring in the day-to-day. There were forms to fill. Shoes to polish. Corsets to lace. And hours of silence. Fred quiet endings. As the 19th century faded, so did many of these brothel traditions. Reform movements gained strength. Laws changed. Districts closed. But the lives of the workers remained largely undocumented. Just small details in city archives or footnotes in someone else's story. Still, we know this much: they lived lives made of routine, repetition, and rest. Their days weren't filled with romance or peril, but with the soft friction of linen, the creak of floorboards, the flicker of candlelight. Work. Rest. Repeat. And in those patterns, so steady, so human, we find a kind of quiet dignity. A life not of scandal, but of schedules. Not of tragedy, but of tea. And that, perhaps, is the truest kind of history there is.